Welcome to the debate. It is March 1st, 2026 today, and looking at the calendar, it's actually been exactly 3 years since the dam broke, since the AI Cambrian Explosion, basically.
An explosion? Or maybe a crime scene, depending on how you look at it.
Always hitting hard right out of the gate. But I get your point. Just a quick note before we really dive in. Since we are looking back at the full history of this, we will be discussing the tragic death and suicide of Suchir Balaji later in the conversation. So just a heads up on that. But going back to 3 years ago today, this industry was essentially a closed fortress. And then, in the span of just 1 month, the entire landscape violently shifted. We went from state-of-the-art AI being the absolute monopoly of Google and OpenAI to something that could literally run on a gaming laptop in some guy's basement in Idaho.
I will certainly concede it was a historic month, but I feel like we have this tendency to romanticize the chaos of March 2023. You know, it gets framed with this lofty word, democratization, but we really shouldn't forget that the foundation of that entire spring fever was built on stolen data and completely ignored warnings.
And that right there is the core of our disagreement today. Was it a necessary liberation, or was it a massive heist? Because today we are looking back at the LML leak, the rise of the whole zoo of models like Alpaca and Vicuna, and that incredibly tragic, often overlooked story of the whistleblower Suchir Balaji. I'm taking the stance that this was a necessary revolution. It was the exact moment innovation was finally unleashed from corporate chains.
And I'll be taking the stance that the cost of breaking those chains was just wildly unacceptable. It broke copyright law, it shattered the economic model for creators, and frankly, it broke the humans caught in the middle of it.
Well, let's take ourselves back to the inciting incident then, the crime scene as you called it. March 3rd, 2023. If you remember the vibe back then, ChatGPT was the only game in town. It was magicked, and it was locked behind an API. But then, this user goes by the name Lamon, posts a magnet link on a 4chan technology board.
A torrent file. And it's important to clarify, especially for anyone who came into the field after 2025, that this wasn't just a leak of program code. This was the actual weights for Meta's LLaMA model. The code is just the engine, right? But the weights, that is the fuel. That is the mathematical crystallization of trillions of words of training. It is the most expensive part of the entire system, something Meta spent millions of dollars in compute to generate.
And suddenly, it was just completely free to anyone with an internet connection. I know Meta tried to issue DMCA takedowns, but
Which is like trying to unspill a glass of water into the ocean.
Exactly. The genie was totally out of the bottle. And I really see that leak as the moment the monopoly crumbled. Before that Friday, if you wanted to build a smart application, you had to pay the big players for API access. After that Friday, anyone could actually own the brain. You can't deny that massive shift in power dynamics.
I don't deny the shift. I question the ethics of how that power was transferred. I mean, this was not a sanctioned open source release. It was an unauthorized leak of proprietary corporate tech. And what followed wasn't careful scientific research. It was an absolute free-for-all. You had engineers all over the globe downloading this massive file, ripping out the safety filters, and hacking it just to get it running on consumer hardware. It was that old Silicon Valley mantra, move fast and break things, just injected with steroids.
But look at the sheer speed of the innovation that came from that. 10 days, that's all it took. March 13th, the Center for Research on Foundation Models at Stanford announces Alpaca. And this is the crucial part for me. Alpaca proved you didn't need a supercomputer to make a smart model. You just needed a really smart teacher.
Right, the self-instruct method. I will say Tetsunori Hashimoto and his team at Stanford were incredibly clever with that. Instead of hiring thousands of humans to write prompts and answers, they just used OpenAI's Text DaVinci 003 model to automatically generate about 52,000 instruction-following examples.
Right, they basically used the massive AI to tutor the little AI.
Knowledge distillation at its finest.
Yeah, and even 3 years later, the part that still blows my mind is the cost. They took that leaked 7 billion parameter LLaMA model, fine-tuned it on this synthetic data, and the total cost of the compute for that training was just $600.
Less than the cost of a decent smartphone.
Exactly. Before Alpaca, the consensus was that training a GPT-class model was strictly a billionaire's playground. Stanford showed us that, no, you could basically do this on a hobbyist budget. That is the very definition of democratization. If that torrent had never been posted, we might still be sitting around believing only big tech could build these tools.
We do need to talk about the actual quality of that $600 miracle, though. Alpaca hallucinated wildly. It had serious toxicity issues. In fact, Stanford had to pull the interactive demo offline almost immediately because of safety concerns and hosting costs. So yes, it was a successful proof of concept, but it also proved exactly what happens when you strip away safety guardrails just to make something cheap and fast.
Fair point. There were definitely growing pains, but those failures paved the way for the next breakthroughs almost instantly. Literally 2 weeks later, March 30th, we get Vicuna.
From the UC Berkeley LMSYS group.
Right. Weilin Chang and that team recognized the data quality issue with Alpaca. So instead of purely synthetic data, they used ShareGPT data, which is actual, real human conversations scraped from people using ChatGPT.
Which is another massive legal and ethical gray area, but we can park that for a second. Technically speaking, Vicuna was a big deal because its outputs felt remarkably human.
Very human. And crucially, thanks to LoRA, they got this running smoothly on consumer GPUs. The term LoRA gets thrown around a lot, low-rank adaptation. But I think it's worth just breaking down what that actually meant for the industry at that exact moment.
Yeah, it's a brilliant technique. Think of a base language model like LLaMA as this massive, multi-volume encyclopedia. The old way of fine-tuning meant you had to rewrite every single page of that encyclopedia, which takes massive amounts of memory and compute. LoRA is basically like sticking a thin layer of Post-it notes into the margins of the book. You aren't altering the original text, you're just training this very thin, lightweight layer of notes that sits on top of it.
That's a great analogy. And because of those Post-it notes, you didn't need a server farm anymore. A couple of high-end graphics cards could do the job. In blind test, Vicuna was hitting like 90% of ChatGPT's quality. I mean, that was the sound of the moat evaporating. It was right around then that the infamous leaked Google memo came out, the one that said, "We have no moat and neither does OpenAI."
It was a technical triumph, absolutely. But this is where I really have to pull the car over. We are sitting here marveling at the speed and the cost efficiency, but where did the actual intelligence come from? Not the fine-tuning data, but the foundational knowledge.
You're talking about the pile.
The pile, and specifically, the dataset component known as Books 3, because LLaMA, and by extension Alpaca, Vicuna, Berkeley's Koala model, all of them were trained on this data.
Just for context, the pile was put together by AI. They were a grassroots research collective trying to keep open science alive in the AI space.
Their mission statement might have been noble, but their methods were essentially digital piracy. Books 3 contained roughly 196,000 books, and these weren't public domain texts provided by a library. They were scraped from Bibliotheque, which is a notorious pirate torrent tracker.
Right, a shadow library.
Yes, piracy plain and simple. The life's work of Stephen King, Margaret Atwood, thousands of working nonfiction authors, all swallowed whole, processed, and turned into those statistical weights we were just celebrating.
I hear you. But the defense from LU3AI in 2023 was a very pragmatic one. They argued that if only Google and Meta had the massive legal budgets to quietly settle lawsuits or make backroom deals to access the world's books, then the public loses. They firmly believe that for the scientific community to study these black box models, researchers needed access to the exact same caliber of training data.
But calling it access is just a euphemism. They redistributed stolen property to train machines that would directly compete with the original creators of that property. It completely normalized this culture of, well, if it's on the internet, it's free for the taking. And it's exactly that mindset that paved the way for the tragedy in late 2024.
You're bringing us to Suchir Balaji. It's striking how rarely his name comes up in the mainstream retrospectives of the last 3 years.
It is deeply unfair that he gets left out, because Suchir wasn't an outsider throwing stones at the tech companies. He was literally inside the machine.
He was at OpenAI.
A truly brilliant young guy. Born in 1998, went to Berkeley, joined OpenAI in 2021. He was a core researcher working heavily on data acquisition for GPT-4.
He knew exactly how the sausage was made because he was the one grinding the meat.
And he ultimately left OpenAI because he became convinced the technology was fundamentally violating copyright law. What I find so compelling and ultimately so heartbreaking about his stance is that he didn't just make an emotional plea. He tried to fight the battle using pure mathematics.
He did. In October 2024, he published that landmark essay, When Does Generative AI Qualify for Fair Use? He took concepts from information theory and directly applied them to copyright law.
Could you break down his argument on entropy for a minute? It's a dense concept, but it's really the linchpin of his whole philosophy.
I'll try to keep it grounded. So, in information theory, entropy is essentially a measure of randomness or unpredictability. Balaji argued that if an AI model outputs text with very low entropy in response to a prompt related to its training data, it means the model isn't just learning concepts. It has effectively memorized the structural expression of the original work.
Meaning, if I ask the AI to summarize Harry Potter, and it spits back something highly specific and structurally identical to Rowling's prose, it's not really creating, it's retreating.
Exactly. And he argued that this high degree of memorization triggers the substitution effect. In U.S. copyright law, Factor 4 of fair use looks at the effect on the potential market for the original work. If the AI serves as a viable substitute for the original, it fails the fair use test. Balaji's mathematical point was that by ingesting this massive amount of data without consent, these models are statistically guaranteed to destroy the market for the original creators.
It is a fiercely logical argument. Though, of course, the major counter-argument, the one pushed by groups like the Chamber of Progress, is that AI training is inherently transformative. They argue it's like a human student reading a biology textbook. The AI is learning linguistic patterns and concepts, not just acting as a digital photocopier.
Except the human student doesn't allow millions of people to instantly query their brain for free. The massive scale fundamentally changes the nature of the act. Balaji saw that clearly. We weren't building tools, we were building replacements.
And the great tragedy is that he didn't live to see the resolution of the debate he helped crystallize.
November 26, 2024. He was found dead in his San Francisco apartment.
The official medical examiner's report ruled it a suicide.
Yeah, though his parents strongly disputed that. They pointed out there was no note, the door was locked from the inside, and he had seemed upbeat. But regardless of where you fall on the circumstances, if you look at the climate back then, we were at the absolute boiling point of the AI safety wars. The psychological pressure on these researchers was just unfathomable. You had the accelerationists screaming that anyone slowing down AI was a traitor to human progress, and the safety camp screaming that the models were going to literally kill everyone.
And caught right in the middle of that is a 26-year-old who just wanted the industry to do the right thing regarding copyright.
I really view his death as the dark center of gravity for this entire timeline. We talk about the LLaMA leak like it was this fun, chaotic pirate adventure, but the intellectual and emotional toll exacted on the actual people building these things gets conveniently ignored. We burn through human capital just as fast as we burned through GPU cycles.
Which brings us to where we stand today in 2026. We do have a vibrant open ecosystem now, and I'd argue it's matured. Databricks gave us DALL-E 2.0 pretty early on, which was the first truly commercially safe open model, because they paid their own employees to generate the instruction data. And now we have data sets like the Common Pile that are significantly cleaner than the old days. The ecosystem did eventually correct itself, didn't it?
Did it correct itself, or did it just launder its original sins? The open models we rely on today are fine-tuned versions of fine-tuned versions that trace their lineage right back to those contaminated family trees. You can't unring the bell. The base intelligence of the models sitting on our laptops right now still relies heavily on that initial pillaging of Books 3 and the open web.
That may be true, but I always try to look at the counterfactual. Imagine a timeline where the LLaMA leak never happened, where Alpaca and Vicuna never existed. We would be living in a pure subscription reality right now. Truth, knowledge, and creativity would be cordoned off, rented out to us by 3 mega corporations. The leak was messy and the legality was highly suspect, but it fundamentally decentralized the power.
Decentralizing power sounds wonderful, right up until you realize you've also decentralized the accountability. When an open model is used to generate deepfakes or rip off a struggling author today, there is no corporate help desk to sue. There's just a GitHub repository and a magnet link.
Man, usually I have a quick rebuttal lined up for that. But looking at the whole arc of this, the leak, the explosion of access, the warnings, and then the utter silence of Suchir Balaji, it is really hard to square the ledger.
We gained incredible tools, we traded away the guardrails to get them, and we lost some really good people along the way. That was the transaction.
If there's one thing to take away from this 3-year anniversary, it's probably that the AI spring of 2023 was never just a technical breakthrough. It was a massive moral intersection, and we collectively chose the road with no speed limit.
And we are definitely still paying the tolls on that road.
Yeah, well, the cars are certainly fast, at least. But I think we will have to leave it there for today. The history of all this is obviously still being written. We can only hope we write the next chapters with a bit more care than the last ones.
Let's hope so.